Right, welcome to the final installment in the over-the-top squishy toggle extravaganza, and here we are where we left off in part 3, and we've just got 3 things left to do in order to reach the state of toggling nirvana. Let's start with the rotation of the button. Now, in order to make this thing rotate, we could just rotate it by some amount that looks okay, and nobody would really notice. But this is code slicing, and we pride ourselves on spending far too much time on things people will never notice. So in order to do that, we need to do a little bit of algebra. That's right, we're going to do some algebra, but fortunately, it's going to be simple algebra. So no worries there. Let's talk a little bit about how we're going to achieve this rotation to make it look like this button is actually rolling. So the important constants here are the diameter, the height of the toggle, and the button diameter ratio. Given that pi is the number of times the diameter of a given circle can fit inside its circumference, then we know that the circumference of a circle is equal to pi times the diameter. But we also know that the diameter of our button is equal to the height times the button diameter ratio. So we can say that d is equal to hb. We can therefore say that the circumference of the button is equal to pi hb. In order to calculate the rotation as it rolls, we need to know the number of full rotations involved in that motion. So we need to know the arc length of this particular rotation. Or what do I mean by the arc length? If we've got a circle and we put it on a road covered in blue paint, then the arc length as it rolls along the road is the length of the circumference that's painted blue. And since we're starting off at an offset of plus half the height and ending up at minus half the height, we know the distance it's rolled is actually equal to the height. So we can say that the number of rotations is equal to h divided by pi hb. And since we've got h on the top and the bottom, we can get rid of it. We also know that the number of radians in one rotation is equal to 2 pi. So if we multiply that by the number of rotations, then the total rotation in radians is equal to 2 pi over pi b. And then we can cancel out the pi's and end up with a very simple result of 2 over the button diameter ratio. And that's going to be negative, of course, because we're going anti-clockwise. So now we know how much we want to rotate it, we can set up a constant to represent that. And I'm going to put it at the top right here. Private let rotation if off, and this is going to be minus 2 divided by the button diameter ratio, and that is going to be in radians. Now you might think we're going to go down to our button and say rotate if not is on, rotation if off. Okay, you might think we'll do that. There are 2 problems with this approach. We don't want to be rotating the button if we don't have to, and since the shading on the button won't change, there's no indication that the button is actually rotating at all, so there's no need to rotate that. The problem with the toggle state icon here is that we don't actually want to be rotating the icon, we want to be rotating the shape. This would be a problem later on when we add the inner shadow, because what would happen is the offset on that shadow would also be rotated, so it wouldn't look like it was under the same lighting conditions as the toggle frame. Instead, we're going to use that rotation if off constant in the toggle state icon shape, so we can rotate the layout guide before we draw the shape using it. And this might answer the question you may have had, which was, why am I using all of the semantic constants on the layout guide? If I'm not using their coordinates, as on line 171, why am I using G leading and G center instead of rect leading and rect center, which are the equivalent points? And what we're about to do is the reason why. If I'd used the constants from rect, then rotating the layout guide would have had no effect on those points. They would have remained where they were. But by using those constants from the layout guide, anything I do to the layout guide as far as transformations are concerned will be applied to those points as well. So the only thing I need to do in order to rotate this thing is to apply the rotation to the layout guide once it's been created. And that looks like this. Rotated, and then we can take our rotation is off there, rotation if off, and we want to animate it based on whether the toggle is off. So instead of going from 0 to 1 when the toggle is on, we actually want to use a factor of 1 to 0. So when the toggle is off, it is rotated, and when it is on, it is in the unrotated position. And we do that by saying 1 minus the animatable data. Factor 1 minus animatable data. So now if I resume, I can click our toggle and it looks like it's rolling along and the icon is transforming as it's rotating. The next thing we're going to do is put on the text, which zooms out from the middle underneath the button and looks quite nice. So we're going to go back up to our body and I'm going to put these in a group because they're going to share the same blend mode and the animation. I'm going to put it above the button because the text has to look like it's coming out from underneath the button. So let's put our group in. Group. I'm going to use a custom text size here. So let's put a constant in for that. Let text size equal the size width scaled 0.15. And now that we've got our text size, let's put on our first piece of text. Custom text on. It's going to be sized the text size. It's going to be white of 0.4 and it's going to have a medium weight to it. And there it is behind the button. And so we can see it. Let's just comment this bit out for now. And what we need to do is set the opacity to this if it's not on to 0. And using conditional modifiers, this is satisfyingly declarative. Let's go to this custom text and say opacity, if not is on, is 0. Now, if I click it, it will disappear when it's off. Perfect. The next thing we need to do is to offset this thing by the same amount the button is offset, which is half the height. So I'm going to say x offset minus half the height, like that. Now, I haven't put that inside a conditional modifier. The reason being is that we're going to scale this up from 0. And because we're offsetting it first, the conditional nature of the scaling is going to take care of the offset for us because the offset will be scaled by the scale that we're about to apply. And we're going to scale that text to 0 if the button is off. Scale, if not, is on 0. And then we can do the same thing for the off state. All we do is duplicate this slot, make that off, and then we change these conditionals to be if. We set the size to be plus half the height, and we say scale if is on to 0. And now when we click it, we'll see our text. There it is. Now there are two things left. We need to make the blend mode multiply, and then we want to put the animation on. Blend mode multiply. That gives it a bit more depth and still picks up a little bit of the color from the toggle. And then I can go down here, take this animation because it's going to be the same, and put it underneath the text. Let's click it again. And there we are. And now we can put the button back on top. It's going to overlay them as they're disappearing and reappearing. So we are almost there. We've just got to put on the inner shadow and then we're done. In order to do that, and in the interest of time, I'm going to go back to the episode we did on inner shadows on views and shapes and nick a little bit of code. Here it is. And where are those extensions? There we are. Right. So I'm going to grab this lot, copy that, and take the spoils back to the current episode. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom, and underneath our shape extension, I'm going to paste it in. We've already got an extension on shape, so we don't need to create another one. I can just delete that, and now it's a bit cleaner. Obviously, I went over this in a lot of detail in that episode that I just pinched this code from. So if you're interested in the thought behind these extensions, please go back and watch that, and it should bring you up to speed. But what you'll notice from the signature on these functions is that in order to style these things, we need a few more parameters. We need the background, the radius, the opacity, and the offset that we're actually going to apply to these inner shadows. And as we're doing in this episode, we're making everything size agnostic. We're going to leave the opacity at the default, but the radius and the offset need to be calculated in relation to the size of the toggle. So let's go back up to our view and set up these constants. There are 3 constants I'm going to set up: the shadow radius, the shadow offset, and the toggle color. At the moment, we're just using green, but obviously that's got to go to red if the toggle is off. So underneath the size, I'm going to say, let the shadow radius equal the width scaled by 0.015. The next thing we need is a shadow offset. Let the shadow offset, this is going to be a CG point initialized with the width scaled by 0.01. And if you initialize a point this way, it's actually going to initialize with X and Y being the same. So that's going to give us a directional offset to the bottom right. The next thing we need is a toggle color, and that's as simple as can be. Let toggle color, which is a color, be equal to, are we on? Yes, then it's green. If not, then it's red. And now we need to modify the signatures on styling. They are in fact both going to take a color which is going to actually be the background of the inner shadow. So we're going to rename that appropriately, and we'll do that after actually passing in the parameters that we want. So when it compiles, we know that we're done. Let's start with the toggle frame. We're going to say that the background is the toggle color. The shadow radius is the shadow radius. And the shadow offset is the shadow offset. And then we can take those arguments and add them to the line width argument we've got on line 58. So grab this slot, move down here, and just add them to that styling. And it's not liking that very much because obviously we need to update those functions. So let's start with the styling in the toggle frame. We're going to rename the first parameter background. Then we're going to add shadow radius, which is a CG float, and a shadow offset, which is a CG point. And then for the else clause, we're going to change that to call the inner shadow extension on shape. Inner shadow, and we want that one. We're going to pass in the background, the shadow radius, the opacity we don't need, and the offset is going to be the shadow offset. And now we're done for the styling on toggle frame. We want to go down to the styling on toggle state icon. But before we do that, let's copy these. And then after the line width, we'll just paste them in. Now, slightly different here is that we've got a stroke on line 220. That's the thing we want to apply the inner shadow to. Because remember, when using a stroke modifier on a shape, it will return a shape if you're not specifying a background. So we've got a shape on our hands that we can apply an inner shadow modifier to, like this. Inner shadow, we pass in the background, shadow radius, we don't need the opacity, and the shadow offset. We resume, and it looks almost wonderful. There's a small problem with this. If you look over to the toggle state icon, we can see a little bit of white at the top and the bottom. And notice that the white starts just where the curve of the stroke starts. And that's indicating that what's happening here is that the view that we're using as a background, in this case the color, extends to the size of that shape. But half the stroke is extending beyond that frame, which happens by default when you put a stroke on a shape. So all we need to do to fix this is to scale the background we're passed in order to cover up that extra bit. And because this is all relative, whatever constant we choose to do this will work when the toggle is any size. So all we need to do is say scale 1.5. It doesn't matter which scaling factor you use, as long as it covers up the white because it's going to be clipped in the inner shadow implementation. And now all we need to do is reduce the duration to something a bit more sensible, like 0.6. And then I promise the very last thing we need to do is to put a shadow on the button itself. So let's go down to the button, shadow with a color of white, 0.1, a radius of shadow radius, and an offset of shadow offset. There we are. Let's go down to our preview. We'll give it a greedy frame. We'll say the background is a linear gradient with the following shades of white, 0.9 to 0.3. We'll send that to the bottom trailing. And we'll also ignore safe areas. And there we have our fully operational and looking wonderful over-the-top squishy toggle. Isn't it fantastic? Impress your friends with your toggling abilities in SwiftUI. Well, there we are. And what a marathon that was. If you made it all the way through to the end, give yourself a gold star. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted after that. It was brutal, wasn't it? If you learned anything though, let me know in the comments. Or if you're having questions or things aren't working out exactly the way you'd expect, let's sort them out together. If you liked it, then give it a thumbs up. It makes me happy, lets me know that you're happy, and helps other people find the channel. There's more of this stuff coming, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing, and there's less chance that you will. If you have any other comments or suggestions, please leave them below. But in the meantime, thanks for joining me. See you next time.